Welcome to Being Human. Delighted to say this week's guest is a major inspiration for me in the Lean-Agile field. Mike Burrows, founder of Agenda Shift and author of Kanban from the Inside and Agenda Shift. Welcome to the show.
Great to be here and great to see you again, Richard. Yeah.
Yes, fantastic. So I would like to start with the genesis of this lean agile journey for you. Obviously, I guess it started before Kanban from the Inside. So is there identifiable moment where you started to get hooked on some of these ideas?
Well, as these things, there's lots of streams that sort of contribute, and a lot of things that happen by accident, I guess. But my background's very much in software development. I started out as a programmer, and rose through the ranks of management in technical organisations, and then more. After that, in banks, I was an executive director and global dev manager at UBS, for example. Left that to be CTO of a energy risk management consultancy. And it was kind of in that transition was when I really started to connect with the Agile community generally and the Kanban community specifically. So that's around 2009. I've been very fortunate that I've been very fortunate that over a long enough career, I'm old enough, I've never really felt that I was working in what we would now describe as a waterfall environment. I've worked with and respected, some great project managers, for example, but I've always had the opportunity to do my thing and to experiment and get to know my customers and all the rest of it. And not claiming that I invented Agile or anything like that, but I think I've been fortunate always to work in those kinds of ways. There was no sort of road to Damascus moment when suddenly I realised that the way that we were doing it was all wrong, and we had to do things completely differently. It was much more gradual than that. But what I did find,
Sorry, I'm just wondering, is it when you said you made that transition to CTO and then you connected to the community, was there something in that transition that had you go a bit deeper? Or?
Yeah, it's just sort of an environmental change as much as anything. I found, working inside a Swiss bank, it's somewhat difficult to be a fully participating member of a public community. I mean, maybe things are a bit different now, but going back to like the late 90s, it just felt like a more difficult thing. But I still worked in an organisation that I still felt it still felt quite agile at the time. And looking back on it. I think it was definitely things that we would do differently if we had a time machine. It can go back, 20 years or 10 years. But I think I've been very fortunate to work at companies that maybe not the bleeding edge, but towards the leading edge of how things are done, how things work in software architecture terms and in organisational terms. So things opened up when I was leaving UBS. I had a bit of gardening leave time. I used a lot of that time to connect with people. I went out to a lot of meetups. I was still living near London at the time. That made it a lot easier, and got to know some of the people in the community. It's really good to actually get to know people as people, rather than just people that tweet and people that blog. So that was really good and really, really encouraging. And then I was, as I mentioned, CTO of it. It was a late stage startup, so it had actually been going about 5 years. And when a startup's been going 5 years, it's probably, or many startups are thinking about the exit, and that was very explicit in my case. My objective really was to get the technology side of the organisation into such a shape that the company could get some either more investment or get taken over or a merger or whatever it might be. To start with a happy ending, it ended up as a reverse takeover. We did merge with a much bigger company, but the MD of the smaller company, the one that I was in, became the MD of the larger company. So that was a pretty happy outcome for them. In the meantime, I was a year and a half of getting into shape, as I described. Backwards and forwards to Budapest. I did a week in Budapest and a week at home. Got to know Ryanair rather too well. And it became the case study. I didn't know at the time, but it ended up becoming a case study for the first book for Kanban from the Inside. What I found was an organisation with a massive problem of work in progress. And it's a problem that they came to recognise for themselves. There were some amazing moments that I described in the book where people, for example, started to give up projects when they realised that just having the project out there was causing more harm than good for the organisation. Recognising that there were actually more projects than there were people in the whole company. That's a problem. The MD looking at the list of uncompleted actions in the minutes of the management meeting and realising that this just has to stop. You can't just have a list that only ever grows. And he metaphorically, if not physically, sort of tore up the minutes and said, we've got to find a different way of doing things. And all that time, we've been visualizing our work, keeping our work in progress under good control and all the rest of it. And, slowly but surely, that understanding, found its way into, other parts of the organization. By the time I left, there were other teams on the business side using Kanban, for example.
Right. And why do you? But that's common in organisations to have lots and lots of work in progress, and maybe common for us as individuals. What do you think that is? Why do you think humans are so prone to having lots of things going on?
It's very easy to say yes. It's also much easier to start something new than to address the problems in something that you're already doing. And it just seems like the path of least resistance, but it's a path of least resistance that is really just a slippery slope down to getting out of control and actually finding you're in a working environment that's much less pleasant than it should be. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, as the saying goes. And without the discipline to choose to focus on the right things and the right number of things and so on, you end up with overburdened systems, and that's difficult. That's uncomfortable. There's lots of ways. I guess there are as many ways to get it wrong. There are more ways of getting it wrong than there are getting it right. I mean, overburdening is only one problem, but it's just a very, very common problem. Part of what I'm in the business of doing is making our working environments more humane, so they work well for us, so that we can actually achieve what we want to achieve, without being unduly oppressed by or hindered by, frustrated by, the systems around us.
Right. And what were the steps you took then in this company when you were back and forth to Budapest, as you said? What were the steps that you took to get that work in progress under control?
It was I had the advantage of coming in, with some seniority. So coming in as the CTO, I made as well as the usual interviews and so on. I spent a week there, so in an unofficial capacity before I started. So that to give kind of a two-way thing, I would have a better understanding of what I was letting myself in for, and vice versa. They got to see a bit of me as well, and I diagnosed this problem very quickly, and found that there was some quite ready acceptance, certainly from my senior colleagues, that this was the case. There was too much activity going on, but not enough to show for it. And they needed some clarity. And I explained, I know a set of tools that's, ideal for solving that kind of problem. And this is what I intend to do. It turned out our bit of office that I had a very suitably large bit of wall to use for visualizing it all. And spent some time with the team, explaining to them how I thought we could do it. As you know, I start these things gently. You know, we'll just start with let's just visualize our work. Let's see what we're dealing with, and then let's see whether it makes sense or not. And you know, when the answer comes back no, then the question is, well, what do we do about it? You know, I had ready answers to that, but that's, you know, I did this as a manager, you know, fairly experienced manager, it has to be said. But what I've learned now, you know, when I go in now as a coach or consultant, it's very, very similar process. It's just you help people to see what obstacles are in the way of achieving what they want to achieve, and then you're looking for some possible ways to you know, to overcome those obstacles and achieve what they want to achieve. I guess I've been doing that for years. It's more formalized. It's more repeatable. It's more transferable now. You know, I you know, now that I make a living teaching this stuff to people and writing and so on, you just have to crystallize what it is that makes that kind of process work.
Right. But it sounds to me like the two big elements was, well, perhaps three. There's the fact you had authority, the fact you had experience as a manager, and the fact that you were, four, as I'm saying it, a good set of tools, which you had at hand, and your physical space. I mean, and we shouldn't ignore that, right? And that comes up over and over in podcasts. Is wall space. It sounds so trivial, and yet it seems to be important.
Yes, I remember hearing you hear some hilarious stories. I think it was Benjamin Mitchell told us, you know, people creeping off to the fire escape where they kept their they kept their board. You know, there's something a bit wrong there when you're doing that. These things all do contribute. You know, it's very easy to forget what were all the conditions to, you know, the particular conditions in any context that makes it successful. And the idea that you just transplant any one of those components and think it's going to guarantee you success somewhere else isn't right. You know, so, you know, the tool on its own doesn't guarantee success, although, you know, we have enough experience now to know that these tools actually do work in a very wide range of contexts. Different people have different attitudes to things like authority and leadership. I happen to believe in both those things. I've, you know, experienced the benefit of them. We've all experienced bad management and bad leadership and so on as well. So you know, you have to take the rough with the smooth. And try to understand what good looks like and how you be a good manager if your role is to be one, and so on and so on. It takes a little bit of humility to accept that not all your successes were down entirely to your own brilliance, but to all these other things that contributed. And you know, a large part of it also is, you know, making sure that the team themselves get all the credit they deserve for it.
And in that situation with Budapest, the team was key, was it?
Yeah, it was actually a very different kind of team to what I've been used to working with before. You know, I've worked in high-tech industries, I've worked in leading investment banks and so on. You know, generally working with extremely qualified people, very experienced people, you know, used to working with high-tech tools, leading edge tools, and so on. And for, you know, perhaps the first half of my career, that was enough for me. You know, I just loved. I was you know, had the chance to play with all these cool things. The Budapest experience was interesting in that half the developers didn't come from a development background. They were people that had worked in business operations. They'd done a load of stuff with you know, Excel spreadsheets and so on. They'd gone from Excel spreadsheets to dabbling in VBA, and some of them found their way onto the IT side. I inherited a team where I think about half the team were people that had come through that kind of progression. A couple of people have been brought in specifically with some Unixy type background, some Python programming background, and so on. we knew we wanted to get away from being a business that was built entirely on Excel. It had got to, amazing as Excel is, it doesn't scale very well. It's not very auditable, and when you're trying to run a business fit to be sold on the basis of its technology, and that technology is all in Excel spreadsheets. You've got to do something about that. So we made sure a lot more. We were basically invested in as the saying goes, in protocols and formats. It was all web based, all protocol based communication. Excel could easily get data from servers and so on. The Excel didn't go away, but the hard work was done done in a more auditable way with servers and databases and all that kind of stuff.
And was there something special about the fact that these guys had come from operations or other areas of business into the development team that made a difference?
Oh, definitely. It's the kind of domain where the technology side wasn't amazingly challenging, at least not to experienced developers. But the business side of it certainly was. Energy risk management is a very, that's a niche thing. Any energy products are quite interesting. They're quite different to the kind of products I've seen on the financial side. They sound similar, but then they just have nuances that you're not used to. I mean, I don't know if you know anything about bond trading, but with bond trading, it's all about calendars and when the cash flow, on what day of the month is the cash flow going to fall, and how you adjust for weekends and month ends and stuff like that. Energy products have all those same kind of things, but then you start to get into seasons like summer and winter and half years that work from summer to summer rather than years that work from summer to summer, and all sorts of strange things like that. The interrelationships between the energy markets is it's obvious when you think about it, but electricity, gas, oil. There is some important correlations between them. Seasonality is a very, very big thing. So when you're in, there's just there's some intricacies and that you need to understand, and all financial products depend on all parties involved knowing what the conventions are, and however crazy those conventions seem to be to you as a programmer. You have to deal with it. So having people with business experience actually in your teams is brilliant. We had there was never not too well. I can say completely exclude it, but instead of just sort of we're the technology team and they're the user team, there was much more of a spectrum where we had ex-business people in the team. We had people between IT and the business who had also had a foot in both camps. I had a strong financial background, having worked in investment banking for more than a decade. So the sort of history of the people in the team and the history of the organisation was interesting and part of its success. And you could say that just about any successful team and organisation. And you look to see what's even when it has problems, and it clearly had problems when I arrived. You also have to give full respect to the things that are working and the context and all these other things. Start with what you do now, as the Kanban principle goes.
Right. And I see that a lot in organizations. That one of the biggest inhibitors to productivity and effectiveness is that you end up with the technical guys on one side of a boundary and the business people on the other. And it sounds like you kind of inherited a team which didn't have that problem to start with.
It was certainly a lot blurrier than it was. And in a company small enough, the whole company was smaller than the department that I used to run. Everybody knew everybody pretty much. It means it's very hard to stop, people asking for favours and all this kind of thing, and so on. So the distraction rate was quite high, which is, I guess, a disbenefit of that level of openness. but it's also part of its success as well. And you learn to respect what's working and nurture that, and just encourage it in a direction that enables business goals to be delivered as well.
Right. And going back to this business about it's easy for us to say yes, it's hard for us to say no. Yes. And so you've got you've got some great ingredients in the team. You've applied these tools. You're using your authority. Yeah. Are there specific levers that you pull around this WIP problem? That you can recall.
We did use explicit work in progress limits. There were things that we experimented with. One very exciting experiment was with pairing. By the time pairing became fashionable, I was already no longer paid to be a programmer. And I had never experienced pair programming. And I don't like to, I don't like mandating things in general, but I certainly wasn't going to mandate a practice I hadn't experienced myself. But there were members of the team that were up for trying it as an experiment. And it was an experiment that was far more successful than I think any of us would have predicted. We had some stable pairings. We tried, rotating pairings and all the rest of it. And what we found, we very quickly got to a point where we had less work in progress than we had people in the team. So this is 2009, 2010 sort of time. And I've since worked with teams where that's a situation we've got to, not straight away, but, as things settle down, as we get into the rhythm of delivery, I found, quite apart from whatever explicit mechanisms we might have for controlling work in progress, whether it be, column limits or, sprint plans, whatever, that teams have got very good at focusing on the particular pieces of work that they have in progress, working collaboratively to get them done.
And why is it that pairing had that effect, do you think? I think one possible reason, one of the reasons for WIP growing is one I mentioned before. It's very easy when you get stuck on something to think, oh, okay, I'll just put that to one side and start something else. I think when you're pairing, you're much more likely to have a conversation about how we're actually going to address that problem. And it kind of encourages a behavior that you'd want, whether people are pairing or not. When someone's got a problem, you want them to put their hands up and say, I need help. And not hold on to that obstacle until the next stand-up meeting or whatever the next formal opportunity there is to share. When you're pairing or mobbing or anything like that, if you have a problem in front of you, it's very natural to have a conversation about that problem and think about what you might do to solve it. And if you find that you can't solve it yourselves, I think you're probably more inclined to ask a third person in who you think might be able to solve the problem and so on. Because you've already got over the barrier of, talking about the problem, in a way, so you're out of one person mode already into a collaboration mode. So it just helps. It just naturally you are practicing some helpful behaviours without realising it, without being told to. It's just a natural part of the setup. Yeah, I can sense that actually. It's much easier for a pair to decide, let's go ask somebody else to help us, than for an individual to take on that vulnerability of I'm stuck.
Yes.
Can you help?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and you mentioned, so pairing, and for those who aren't familiar with those terms, pairing is when two people, one screen, working on a product problem together, a programming problem. What's mobbing for people who may not be familiar?
So mobbing is where the team as a whole, or at least a significant number of people more than two, spend some time working on something together, and it's now a fairly well established thing, and there are some sort of norms for how to run it. There's somebody at the keyboard. There is someone sort of navigating. A good metaphor is like rally driving. There's someone, or maybe driving in the on Safari or something like that. Got someone driving, someone navigating. You've got people keeping lookout, people solving problems. So it's a very intense conversational experience, and what you're doing is bringing the kind of behaviours that you would see when you are facing a really serious and urgent challenge, like a production problem, for example. And you're bringing that kind of way of working into the development environment. It's one of these things that's not for everybody, and maybe even for most people, not all the time. But as a way of either getting over a significant hurdle, or for just creating, some shared knowledge, or even just some buzz. It's a way of achieving that. Something, another tool to have in the kit bag.
Right. Okay. So you're back and forth to Budapest. You don't realise it, but this is going to become the case study for your first book. And then talk us. And did you write your first book while still having a day job?
No, I had. I'd finished the CTO job. I went full on into the Kanban community at that time. I did some work on and off with David Anderson. I mean, the first thing I did after leaving the CTO job was to do some consultancy, flying under David's flag at a bank in South Africa. And it was really
David Anderson, for people who aren't aware, he's a major figure in the Lean community.
He wrote the first community. So his book came out 2011. Mine came out 2014. So we worked together on and on. I was flying under his flag when I went to South Africa, worked for a very different kind of organisation. To some horror, the people I was working with realised that there were people there who, got to their mid-20s and never seen a project actually completed. Many, not just months, but years, to finish a project. I was told by somebody that they knew what they would be doing a year and a half from now because it was on the project plan. And my reaction to that was almost physically sick. I was thinking, if someone told me what I would be doing a year and a half, had a task for me a year and a half from now, I would feel insulted. That was my honest reaction to it. We're on a journey, we're all growing, and the idea that you're going to tell me what I'm going to be doing a year and a half from now, I'm sorry, but that's not how I roll. So when I talked at the beginning, about humane and inhumane systems, I honestly, to me, that is inhumane. The idea that we're going to nail down what everyone's going to be doing for the next couple of years is just ridiculous. And certainly a long way away from the kind of what we know now about how particularly software products should be written, highly collaborative, important degree of experimentation in it, and so on. We all know how painful large projects are to deploy. If you save up all that pain for the end, then it's going to be very painful. If you learn to do these things early and often, then it just becomes part of the way that you work. These lessons have been learnt again and again and again over recent decades, and actually were known long before waterfall became a thing. This is one of the ironies, is that waterfall was just a mistake. When I was reading an article, I'm quite familiar with the history of waterfall.
Don't tell that to the Prince guys, right?
Well, it's probably the DoD that we have to thank for it. DoD 2167. Their standard for how software should be delivered, and they read the first half of a paper which described waterfall as a way of not doing it. And they ignored the part where they said, well, actually, most software gets written iteratively and incrementally, and with a large amount of experimentation. We can never fully specify a software system up front. the specification will be as complicated as the software itself. So don't even try. It's you lead to a proof by contradiction if you think it through. So unfortunately, we were told, through the 70s and 80s that, or through the 80s at least, I don't really remember. I'm old enough to remember the 70s, and I wasn't working then. We were told that was doing it properly, and what we're going through, we're still at the end of repaying that. 2 generations, or at least a generation of managers, were told that waterfall was doing it properly. And many of them still believe it, and there's still an industry supporting that worldview. And that's what we're up against. And I'm now very deliberate about not saying anything that comes from that worldview, supports that worldview, and so on. And I'm making that increasingly explicit. So that's what the next book will be about. In fact, it's going away from Agile being about different levels of backlog and planning and activities and so on, which might be Agile, but might also be just a reincarnation of that old waterfall way of thinking, and instead, retell Agile, but in terms of outcomes, objectives, goals, all those kind of things, and working backwards from business outcomes, needs being met, those kinds of things. So they're called right to left. It's just about starting on the right with the outcome, and understanding that everything that we do leads up to those outcomes. And I just refuse now to describe Agile or Agile processes in ways that start on the left with backlogs and so on. It's we are still pandering to that old way of thinking, and I feel that we're just destroying Agile with this sort of steady drip, drip, drip of accepting the old way of describing things and the old way of thinking, and forgetting that Agile was actually a radical departure. It ought to be a paradigm shift, but we're in danger of just falling back into those old ways of talking and thinking. And I'm making a deliberate effort to refrain from that.
Right. And it starts with starting with the end in mind, which actually is one of the things you open Agenda Shift with, right?
Exactly. So that was the very opening sentence of Agenda Shift was, begin with the end in mind. One of Stephen Covey's principles. You might have seen my definition of done as well. Someone's need was met. It's my definition of done. I mean, it's a deliberately annoying, subversive statement. It doesn't necessarily hold up to intense scrutiny, but I'm making a point, and most people get that. That's quite funny. The reaction on LinkedIn, I got something like it was the number of sort of likes and comments on when I first published that was into 3 figures, and so I was enough to actually say 95% of the reaction was positive. And there's this 5% of people that are really annoyed that I've subverted a cherished Agile concept of the definition of done. But I think most people realise that was making an important point, that if you think that done is code complete, then you are totally and utterly missing the point.
Or code shipped or whatever. Yeah.
Yes.
Someone's need got met. I like that. And this also chimes with, so we had, I don't know if you're aware of Finn Golding, who's co-written a couple of books around flow. He's the international CTO at Aviva. But one of the things he talks about is this idea of possibility-oriented conversations as being key in the whole process of establishing flow in organizations. And this sounds similar, right? Start with the outcome, start with the end in mind, start with the possibility.
Yes. Perhaps now a good time to talk about Agenda Shift then. So Agenda Shift is like right to left for organizational change. Although Agenda Shift happens to be the book that came first. It's outcome-oriented change. And it kind of works a little bit from both directions, but an important thing to establish is some ambition and some idea of the outcomes that you want to achieve, what you need to achieve as an organization, what you want to achieve as a team, some picture of what it will feel like when it's working well as a team. So that's begin with the end in mind, but also start with what you do now. It sounds like a contradiction, but all we're saying is, begin with the end in mind is about the outcomes that we want to achieve. Start with what you do now is about our present reality. And then you look for what some people call the adjacent possible. Where are the opportunities? What are the obstacles that we need to overcome? What are the outcomes behind those obstacles? What are the outcomes behind those outcomes, and so on? And actually, what you're doing is mapping out a landscape of obstacles and outcomes, rather than of specific actions or specific practices. And that allows you to have, just-in-time conversations about the actual solutions that we might want to try, or the actual experiments that we want to try. So you could call it a lean thing of, just in time, or agile last responsible moment in terms of coming to the detail. But it's, but at the same time, it's not just about, looking only at our feet and shuffling forwards, in a particular direction. We need a bit of ambition as well, and understanding what it is we want to achieve. And it's not enough just to, I don't want to criticize continuous improvement, because it's one of those things that's so fundamentally important. But some people seem to take continuous improvement as meaning that we continuous in the mathematical sense, that we only make infinitesimally small changes and we never do anything risky or ambitious. And that's not right either. And the key to unlocking it is agreement, which is one of the, going back to the Kanban thing, that was one of the values of my values model for Kanban that became the basis of the book. You got agreement and outcomes, then suddenly everything is possible. Now we all want this. Now we're all pulling in the same direction. Now it's just a matter of how are we going to achieve this thing that we all want to achieve. So a significant,
and that's the right way round, isn't it? It's start with the possibility and then ask the question of how. And so often you find in these sort of agile transformation engagements, you start with the how, and it's like
yes. So I'm never selling practices now. I'm facilitating a process where I help people to agree on what it is they want to achieve, and then we can work together on achieving it. And if they can do that themselves, fantastic. If they need some help achieving it, well, I'm happy to give it. Either way, as the saying goes, when they've done it, they can say that they did it themselves. And that's the art of war, isn't it? I think it's several hundred years, if not a couple of thousand years of leadership thinking in a nutshell. There, in a way. So I think, as I said in writing a few times this year. I'm 53, and we're devoted to outcomes one way or another. We're an industry dominated by solutions rather than outcomes. And that's true on the agile side as much as it is on the technology side. We are so into our frameworks, for example. I'm not anti-framework, but I'm anti the imposition of frameworks. If we can agree what it is we want to achieve and then use the frameworks as a reference, as a source of inspiration, as a source of solutions, fantastic. But the idea of, following a linear left to right plan as a way of imposing a framework on people, that's anathema to me. I won't have any part of that.
And what have you learned along the way then of helping people get clear on their outcomes? What have you found to have worked?
Well, I've developed some tools to help with that. So, Agility Shift comes in 5 parts, but the first 2 parts of those, discovery and exploration, are all focused on helping groups of people, arrive on a set of outcomes that they want to achieve. And one of these happy accidents, I stumbled across clean language as I was developing this stuff. So the basic history of Agenda Shift is at the end of Kanban from the Inside, which is a values-based treatment of Kanban, there's a kind of a checklist at the back, organised by value. It's a little while since I've actually read my own book. But there was like a lot of books finish with a checklist or a bullet list. And interestingly, a number of people independently realised that set of bullets at the back of the book was potentially the basis of an interesting assessment tool, at least a checklist. And I was one of those people, perhaps unsurprisingly. But what we actually have now as an assessment tool is radically different to what was in the back of the book. We clearly had to do something so that it was standalone from the book. So each prompt now stands alone. You don't have to have read the whole book to understand it. And that took us in an interesting direction. It turned out that the more we removed jargon from the assessment, the more digestible it was for people, that the more willing people were to try it. And I did a number of iterations with Dragan Čočić, who I think you know. Between the two of us, we developed a style where every prompt was written in the present tense, not described as something impossibly aspirational, but something that actually I can see how this might work. And non-prescriptive. It said nothing about Kanban, said nothing about Scrum, nothing about it didn't. Every prompt could be interpreted and implemented in a number of different ways. Inclusive as well. Every prompt starts with we, or nearly every prompt starts with the word we, and the few that don't tend to start with the word our, and so on. So we developed this house style of this inclusive, non-prescriptive style of assessment, and used it in a variety of contexts, used it with people outside of IT, interestingly, as well.
What are you assessing? What's the intent here?
Well, the intent is to discover, the goal is to discover what opportunities are there to improve your delivery process. And the assessment tool is organised according to 6 of the 9 values from my book. So transparency, balance, collaboration, customer focus, flow, and leadership, with a half a dozen or so prompts and under each of those. Part of Dragan's contribution was to make sure that it went beyond what was written in my book. It had good broad coverage of the lean and agile landscape. People use the assessment. They score every prompt on a scale of 1 to 4. But the scoring process is just to force them to think about how this is actually working in their organizations now. It's not because we are actually trying to measure the organization. And the workshop process is to prioritize the assessment and just identify, what are the top 3 or top 5 prompts of the 43 that represent the areas of greatest opportunity. And that basically was it when I started, 3 years ago now. But we've, through incorporation of things like clean language, and there's things we've learned from Kanban as well. We've turned that into...
Just pause there, because there may be a few people who are like, clean language, Kanban.
Okay.
So should we unpack that a bit and for people?
Well, I'll unpack that a bit. So I mentioned obstacles and outcomes. And so what we've turned into a game, a coaching tool called Clean Language, which is it's come from its history is it's come, like a lot of things in coaching, it's come from the therapeutic world, psychotherapy, and has been adopted by some parts of the coaching community. Now, I don't use it in a therapeutic sort of way. I'm very clear that I'm not a therapist. But I saw that a certain subset of the clean questions, and the clean questions are very interesting. They are questions that force the asker of the questions to minimize the assumptions that they are making, and encourages them to ask questions out of genuine curiosity rather than in a way that is leading the witness to particular kind of answer. And the kind of questions they just can't, well, there is some skill in choosing what questions to ask, but you can't lead the question. You can't lead the witness in the way that you would with Socratic questions, for example. So we start with obstacles, and it might just be, our stand-up meetings are rubbish or something. That's that's an obstacle. And then you just ask the question, well, what would you like to have happen? And I'd like stand-up meetings that where people don't feel that it's wasting their time, where we're having productive conversations and so on. And you've gone from obstacle mode to outcome mode straight away. And you can then ask very simple questions. So when we have these better stand-up meetings, then what happens?
And what's interesting there is you've gone from obstacle to outcome without any talk about solution. So that sounds to me like discipline.
Yes, well, the game's called 15-minute photo, and the photo stands for from obstacles to outcomes. The two main questions are what would you like to have happen and then what happens. So you're going from obstacle to outcome and then outcome to more outcomes, and you can go more distant outcomes, more abstract outcomes, and so on. There are other questions that we ask as well. What kind of? I love the what kind of question. It's a much nicer way of saying, of asking, can you be more specific? A good example of this. If you told me you were going on holiday next week, I could ask, what kind of holiday, rather than where are you going? If I say where are you going, I'm already making an assumption that you're going to travel somewhere. And if then you say, well, actually, I'm not going anywhere, I'm just staying at home, and you sound a bit embarrassed about it. If I say what kind of holiday, and you say, oh, I'm going to be redecorating my house, that's okay. That's fine. So it's
an invitation for me to explore rather than describe.
Exactly. And in the end, the wording is important in the sense that people have practiced these questions and they know that they work. But actually, what's much more important is the intention. And you, just by practicing them, you learn to what it's like to ask genuine questions out of curiosity and without knowing the answer, as opposed to the kind of leading and loaded questions that we tend to ask. And when you've done it a few times, then when you do ask a leading question, you suddenly sort of see a little red light go off in your brain, and it's really helpful. And I tell people, it would be weird if you were to use these questions all the time, and it's important to understand, the contract you have with the people that you're working with before you do it too overtly. But you don't need to ask anyone's permission to be curious. You don't need to ask anyone's permission to ask questions that are, stripped of assumption and so on. And so it's good to practice these things. And it's important as managers, for example, to be able to talk in terms of outcomes, explore outcomes. If you're a manager and your organization is going agile and you've been used to telling people what to do and people are used to being told what to do, and now you're being told, now your teams need to be self-organizing, where do you start? But actually, self-organization is easy when people have a clear goal to organize around. So if you've got the tools to explore goals with people, that's a really useful tool to have as a manager, let alone as a coach. So I find that teaching these ideas inside organisations has very obvious business benefit. I'm not going in as a therapist. I'm going in to help uncover or help organise teams of people together, groups of people together, to articulate things that perhaps haven't been well enough articulated before.
And I can really see that. So I can see the clean language is an exploration and helps you get to outcomes. And I can see that the assessment helps people think in different ways. And we've got into this a little bit before, but is there a danger that the assessment comes with a set of biases and in a sense is leading in itself and may risk closing down the exploration by having that formatted set of prompts?
We'll go back to, what's your contract again? I'm generally brought into places because I'm known to have a agile track record, a lean Kanban track record, and so on. And the organisations that hire me generally would like more of that. If they want an anthropological study of the organisation, then they should hire an anthropologist. But the assessment is, as would you call it's transparency? Transparency is a bias, you could say. Balance is a bias. We know that these things help in particular ways. And when you help organisations to be more transparent, to get a better balance between demand and capacity, when you help people to collaborate and so on, we tend to know how these things tend to work. But that's why people hire us. And I don't think we should be embarrassed about that. We don't start from first principles every time. So that's context, as always, is everything. I'm hired with that particular end in mind, and I've got an assessment that I'm proud of. I'm very happy to work out a way of doing it in a way that doesn't prescribe practices, so I can be true to my own personal values in terms of being against imposition, and force feeding stuff to people doesn't work. It disengages people rather than engages people. I want, if I want to build or help build humane systems inside organisations, I need to act appropriately myself. And so that's what I've done.
So the way I'm actually interpreting that is it something like we find that having clusters of conversations around these themes tends to serve a goal of improving delivery? Is it something like that? Right.
Yes.
And this will help you.
I'll give you a concrete example of that. Private workshop 6 weeks ago. And I had the room divided into 3 table groups. And all 3 table groups honed in on the imbalance between workload and capacity as being the most serious issue for them as a department, perhaps as an organisation, certainly as a department. That was very, very consistent. And different organisations have different needs, different obstacles that they need to overcome. But for them, that was the one big thing. And they completely bought themselves into that and their own particular ideas for addressing that problem. And the funny thing is, in that situation, is that they are able to suggest to each other more extreme solutions than I would dare propose myself, and that's great. And I had similar experiences in Hungary as well. Like I said, the team were quite happy to impose pairing on themselves. I was not willing to impose that on them. So agreement on the obstacles that we're facing, agreement on the outcomes that we want to achieve is a very powerful thing, and I don't underestimate it. Every organisation picks on the same things quite often. I think probably the most common prompt that gets chosen or prompts that get chosen are actually around customer collaboration rather than around the balance stuff. There are, 20 years of Agile hasn't solved the customer collaboration problem. There's still a long, long way to go in that. Some of the prompts in the assessment talk about needs and exploring them. They talk about owning work until we've established that the need has been satisfied. And that sort of whole end to end from discovery and research through to not just delivery but validation. Most organisations still have some way to go in getting that end to end holistic, approach to needs and outcomes. And so many organisations home in on those actually as being areas ripe for improvement. And I'm very happy to see that. The customer focus category in the assessment is generally the one that comes out the weakest, which might come as a surprise, when we think of how long, Agile has been talking about customer collaboration as being a key value. But we have a long way to go. But there are some there's great work being done out there in areas like user research and discovery and prototyping and validation and so on and so on. We've made a lot of progress in those areas in the time since the manifesto was written.
Right.
And since many of the famous frameworks were developed, so quite a lot of my work is amplifying some of those things. I've been a supporter of government digital services in the UK, which has made a strategic play of needs. I'm talking outcomes all the time. We do a lot with validation, lean startup, hypothesis-based approaches to both change and product development, and the same tools work very well in both spaces, and so on.
Any surprises for you in terms of because you've done a number of these assessments now, right? Are there any, and also those within your network? Any surprises?
I think to start with, it did come as a surprise that customer focus was quite consistently a problem area. And another surprise was that the leadership category quite often comes out top. And I think maybe the questions are too easy to answer. I'm careful not to put it like this when I'm on a private gig. But when I'm doing a public workshop or something, I'll make a wry comment about it's great to see all this leadership being put to such good use. When customer focus is looking rather embarrassing. I think the leadership area is actually an area for some future development as well. I've been actively exploring in collaboration with some other people, possible relationship between agenda shift and viable systems model, which is probably the best model we've got for, how organizations survive and thrive. And from a change management, got a part of the organization that's changing quickly because you're deliberately encouraging change to happen, through an agile transformation or whatever it might be. Is it just going to continue to have a healthy relationship with the rest of the organization? I don't think it's safe to take that for granted. And I would like to make that more explicit and think about how do we encourage both sides of that boundary, the transformation boundary, to thrive. For the conversations between the two sides to be, not just respectful at a human level, but effective at a corporate level as well. So that's an area for some active research for me, over the next few months.
And for people who, I've heard it in passing, that set of ideas before, the viable systems model, just as a few headlines of what that's about.
It's a big background. So we're sort of going back to like a lot of good things seems to come from the 70s. Servant leadership was another one.
Not just the flares.
Not just the flares. I'm old enough to remember flares. So we're talking about management cybernetics. So it's a sort of branch of systems thinking and so on, it's a lot of it's based on the work of Stafford Beer, and he did a study of put together a model of for any viable organisation, and this applies to the whole organisation, but also to teams within the organisation. What elements need to be present? And there are elements like you need some ideas of where you're going. There needs to be some strategy. There needs to be some development. You need to make sure that your organisation, your team, remains fit for purpose as the environment changes, as the challenges that your organisation faces change over time. You actually do need to deliver stuff. You need a clear sense of purpose guiding that delivery. You need monitoring to make sure that what you think you are delivering is what you actually are delivering. That that it's performant and effective enough. and so on and so on. It's a nicely recursive model. It works at the whole organisation level and levels below. And the bit of most interest to me isn't just what are the bits that you need to create I've managed large departments, for example, and I can understand viable system model from that point of view. But how those sort of whole part relationship works, how my department faces off to, the people above me, how the different parts of my department, I've managed a global department, so, I've experienced this, but how they interact with each other is interesting and important. And that's hard enough when the organisation is stable. When you're deliberately changing it as well. You don't want the medicine to be worse than the disease. So I think we would learn something from paying attention to that stuff. So I'm glad to found a group of people interested in some of the same things.
And you talked about linking that specifically to the leadership space. Is that right?
Yeah, well, at least in the sense that perhaps the leadership prompts are a little bit too easy to answer strongly, and includes things that you'd absolutely want to be answered strongly. So, one of the prompts that consistently gets a strong answer is, basically boils down to we treat each other with respect, regardless of role and response, but regardless of role and level of seniority and so on. And you'd be disappointed if that didn't get a high score. And maybe be embarrassed to give a low score, even if perhaps a low score was deserved as well. So perhaps it's not surprising. With questions like that, it's perhaps not surprising that it comes out high. But I'm wondering now whether we should ask some questions that ask some tough questions about organisational design, and using the viable system model as perhaps a way of identifying. Possibly some gaps in our model. Reconciling different models is always a good exercise. It's where you find gaps. One model to a tune of another, smashing things together, all sort of different techniques for. These are innovation techniques that we're applying to our own stuff. What we're doing.
Right. Okay, and is that likely to be a theme in the next book as well? The right to left.
Yes, definitely. So there are, the early chapters are, some basic stuff about Lean and Agile, but both of those from a very much more right to left perspective. So right to left for Lean is actually very natural. And principle number one for Lean is start with value as created in the eyes of the customer, and really we're working backwards from that. Do the same for Agile. So a nice sort of right to left description of Agile is people collaborating over working software that is already beginning to meet needs. That describes an Agile team already underway. And if you're not there already, then you want to be moving to that pretty quickly. And if you're not trying to get to that pretty quickly, then begin to question how Agile it is.
And I can also see that would translate to other knowledge work, actually, and other knowledge artifacts, right?
Oh, absolutely, yes. Then a chapter, describing, the important frameworks at the, not at the scaled framework level, but things like Kanban, Scrum, design thinking, DevOps, XP. That kind of level of thing, and introducing those really as not competing frameworks, but patterns to be combined. So saying something about the goals of each, the philosophies of each, and how they complement each other. So that's the third chapter. The fourth chapter, we do get to scaling. And it's very hard. I think it'd be wrong to address scaling without also, being open to perhaps an audience that's not familiar with it, that it's a contentious subject. But at the same time, I want to be fair and generous to, each body of knowledge as well. And the kind of line that I'm taking is I'm very happy to see, even the scaling frameworks as reference models. But the choice of framework actually in the end matters a lot less than how you choose to implement it. I think a left to right implementation imposition of a framework over people's resistance to them is an inhumane act, unlikely to not end well. Imposing process and practice on people tends to disengage them. And that's not a good outcome for anybody. And it's particularly ironic when you're trying to encourage agile and collaboration and all those other things. So I will talk about engagement models, which is also, of course, an excuse to talk about agenda shift as well. Agenda shift being, really an engagement model, but also a chance to finish with stuff about, bigger picture organizational themes and introducing viable systems model. There's a chapter on strategy and control. And the outside-in model is the way I'm approaching those. So starting with the customer and working our way into the core of the organisation and kind of exposing the contradictions between the different layers as we do it. As so one model for strategy workshops that I'm doing now, but also the outside-in service delivery review and applying that same idea to how we look at our organisational performance. Starting with the customer measures of satisfaction, the narrative stuff that we're hearing from the help desk and all that kind of stuff, and working our way in through different layers, product and platform and so on. Not looking for one metric to chase, but looking for a multi-dimensional view of how we're doing and what we need to do, and an opportunity also to look at the experiments that we're running as well. And as a bit of deliberate organisational design, if we are regularly reviewing progress on our experiments, then we're creating the expectation that they are happening and that we are changing and adapting as an organisation.
And I actually liked one of your recent blog posts on that and being explicit about where an experiment had been rejected, right?
Yes.
Actually having that public.
Yes, a great opportunity for learning, and you learn at two levels. You learn at the level of, okay, we thought this about the customer, or we thought this about the organisation. It turned out not to be true, and that's something we've learned. But also, our process of learning was that a long, painful, and expensive process, or was the design of our experiment such that we invalidated our assumptions quickly and cheaply? And if you learn to invalidate assumptions quickly and cheaply, you learn to make very rapid progress. The last chapter is called Upside Down. So that's inverting the pyramid, servant leadership, those kind of things. So again, sort of starting at the bottom with, or at the top, depending which way your pyramid is. But starting with delivery, then moving to organisational themes. In terms of strategy and monitoring, and then finishing with sort of more leadership aspects. So that's, but whether it's right to left, outside in, or upside down, it's putting the customer at the beginning of our conversation each time.
Right. And as you're sort of describing this, I'm so struck by is your drive in all of this. This is the third book. There's the framework. There's a network of other facilitators that you train and nurture. Yeah. What's in this for Mike? What's driving you through this?
Someone asked me, who was it? I think it was a mutual friend of ours again. Ray Edgar asked me, why did you write Kanban from the Inside? And I said, I had to. and he said he was very relieved at the answer. I didn't just write the book because someone asked me to write a book. I wrote a values-based treatment of something that already existed. It was a new treatment of something that the insiders knew. They kind of had a gut feeling. They thought about it the same way that I did, but the external view of it was one of, this is just a bunch of tool heads, who just love their tools. And getting to the values and the philosophy of any framework is a really important way of understanding it, and coming from the Kanban side, and I came to understand the values and philosophy of Scrum and other frameworks. Then I learned to pay them a lot more respect. and that became how I've, even in that Kanban book, I approached other bodies of knowledge in the same way, and I kind of continued in that same vein. From values to outcomes was a very, very easy leap, and the Agenda Shift book was a way of addressing the problem of change management in an outcome-oriented way. There's a bit of family circumstance to it as well. I spent best part of 2 years hardly leaving home because of a sick child in the family, very sick child in the family. I wrote a lot of the book in Florence's bedroom, and when it was still dark outside. Without going into too much detail, she was on a ventilator. Alarms going off at night, and it gets to 4 o'clock in the morning, and I think I'm not going to get back to sleep. I might as well get my laptop out, and I did a lot of the work in a room. And I am naturally an early riser, and I find that quite often I do some of my best work before anybody else is awake. And then you think, when you've done some good work before breakfast, you think, well, the rest of the day is a bonus now. so that's how that happens. Some of that is just circumstance. But also, it's a deliberate career decision as well. I have, like I said earlier, I've got to a time of life where I can think about what does the rest of my career look like, and I want the rest of my career to be focused on outcomes. I think the Agile community, or the health of the Agile community, would benefit from more focus on outcomes. So I think I'm writing a book that needs to be written, and it's probably my best chance to write a book for a mainstream audience as well. It'll be a book that I hope practitioners will read, but also a book that that managers will read. I mean, one of the phrases I came up with when I was planning it was a book that you would give your manager and hope that they would give to theirs. So that's kind of gives you an idea of the sort of the tone of the book. It's not it won't ever be set as a university textbook. It needs to be readable, but the theme needs to be one that people will grasp. But it's a theme that's contrary to the way that managers work now. It's a theme that's contrary to the way a lot of Agile is done now.
And there's too much. What need are you meeting? To go back to your definition.
I have had the benefit of working in working environments where people are very focused on goals and understand that the technology is a means to an end and not the point. Or they understand the frameworks are a means to an end and not the point. And when you go into organizations and you see people having stuff inflicted on them, when you work in organizations and you see people working on projects task by task, disconnected from the needs that they're going to be meeting by the work that they are doing, that's poor for them, but it's also poor for the organization as well. You are wasting all the creativity of those people in your organizations. It's poor for the customers. If your way of delivering software is ticking off requirements line by line, you can pretty much guarantee that you will deliver a mediocre system. And I can give plenty of examples of mediocre systems. I'm sure you can think of them. If you are focused on meeting needs and you take the trouble to see whether you're actually meeting them or not, you will build better systems. And that is not as well understood as it needs to be. And even in the Agile world, I see too much going on that makes me think that not everyone's got this, and it needs it needs to be said in the word isn't forceful, but clear. We need to be clear that Agile has to be different. Otherwise, we're just going to go back to back to doing it properly. You know,
I get all that. I'm still interested in, for the manager that you've got in mind, who's going to give this book to another manager. What do you envisage the need you're meeting in that manager?
I think if a manager understands how it can work when teams are working in an outcome-oriented way, a goal-oriented way, a value-oriented way, and so on, in a way where they are taking seriously their responsibility to meet needs, that unleashes something, and it helps them understand their contribution to creating the environment where that is possible, and helping them understand that some of the existing structures in their organisation are working with a default assumption that we are going to work to a plan and work through a list of requirements, not work in that more goal-oriented way. So I think it will give managers an understanding of that way of looking at Agile that will help them be better managers if their organisation has a stated intention of embracing Agile in some way.
So it's a need in them to become better managers?
It's a need. I hesitate to tell people to be better because it's a bit judgmental. But they will need to behave in different ways if they want to unleash that kind of creativity in their teams, if they want their teams to build products that do meet user needs and customer needs in a more satisfactory way. By definition, that is better products. And that should lead to better business outcomes as well. It should, in the end, be better for everybody. And it's I want to put that in to clarify that as much as I can. It doesn't need to be deeply technical, but it does describe a very different way of looking at how teams deliver, how organisations deliver.
Wonderful. Okay, well, I'm really looking forward to the book. I'm sure a lot of your fans out there are. So my final question I'd like to ask a lot of my guests is, for you, Mike, what does it mean to be human?
That's a good question. It's funny, just sort of at a personal level, I've been sort of confronted with the frailties of life in the last few years. But I think perhaps not so much frailty, but at least fallibility is part of being human. And I think when we accept that we're all fallible in different ways, we've all had very different experiences, and that shapes the way that we perceive the world and perceive each other. And that starts to help you be a little bit more, empathetic towards others and make things better for other people. And I, kind of wish organisations were a bit more like that as well. They had systems that, accepted that you can't regiment everything, that you can't control the duration of every task. And as soon as you try to do what's actually not possible, you make the organisation a little less humane and actually less productive. You kind of, that's that's a phrase that David Anderson uses as well. It's you kind of need to understand and respect the human condition, and I think if you can do that, that helps you be a better person in terms of how you relate to other people. But I think you can build better organisations if you understand that as well.
Yeah, I can certainly agree with that. Okay, well, to wrap up then, where's the best place for people who've listened to this and want to understand and more, I guess, the Agenda Shift website? Is that the best? That's
a good place to start. So agendashift.com. If you're interested in the 3 books, including the one still to be written, agendashift.com/books will give you links to all 3 of them. We have a cool Slack community. Again, you'll easily find that from agendashift.com. There's a whole load of free resources as well. Quite a lot of what I've produced is now Creative Commons. So the clean language game, for example, that I mentioned, you can download everything you need for that. There's a video showing it in use. Some of the games that I've produced, Change Ban and Feature Ban, are there. Some of the agenda shift workshop materials, even I've open sourced. Not the whole thing, but certainly bits. But the digestible chunks of it have been open sourced. So there's plenty there to look at. There's a LinkedIn group as well. That's not as active as the Slack group. It's more a play. Every blog post goes there. So it's a way of keeping track to that extent. There's a monthly mail shop goes out with a summary of the month's activity. But yeah, agendashift.com will tell you where all of that is.
Fantastic. Well, we'll definitely put a link to that in the show description, and a couple of the other things you've referenced: clean language, viable systems, and so on. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
No, it's been a great tour of all your work. I really enjoyed it. I hope the audience does too. So, yeah, thanks once again, Mike Burrows. Thank you.
Thank you.